I pushed the door open with the quiet certainty of someone who has nothing to fear, yet what greeted me shattered the ground beneath my feet. There, tangled in sheets that once held only my body, was Matthew, my husband, my supposed protector, his bare skin pressed against Claire's, my sister's trembling frame. For a heartbeat, the room blurred into fragments of color and sound, and the air grew so heavy it seemed to choke me. My ears filled with the relentless pounding of my heart, louder than their startled gasps. Claire's eyes, once mirrors of shared childhood secrets, widened with shame, her lips parting but no sound escaping. Matthew stuttered something, his voice suddenly stripped of authority, but their words could not pierce the cocoon of ringing silence enveloping me. I stood frozen, the air tasting of betrayal, and in that instant, I felt the woman I once was die. The scene unfolded in grotesque slowness, as though time itself refused to move forward without my permission. I saw every detail, the twisted bed sheets clinging to their damp skin, Matthew's hand gripping Claire's wrist in a desperate attempt to cover what could not be hidden, the golden light from the lamp illuminating the sweat on their foreheads like a spotlight of guilt. I could not blink. My eyes burned, yet I forced them open, unwilling to let this image fade. The silence screamed. My chest rose and fell like waves against rocks, shallow, unsteady, dangerous. I tried to form words, but my throat closed tight, sealing my grief inside. All I could hear was that monstrous drumbeat within me, hammering louder, faster, until I thought it might burst from my chest. It wasn't anger that moved first. It was numbness, a paralyzing void that left me hollow. Claire's face drained of color, her lips trembling as if begging me not to see what was already etched into my bones. She reached for the blanket, pulling it against her body like a child shielding herself from a storm. Matthew, on the other hand, scrambled for words, his mouth opening and closing with pathetic desperation. Jade, it's not what, but the excuse died as quickly as it was born. His eyes flicked to the drawer on my side of the bed, as though he knew what lay within it before even I did. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had spent years teaching me to trust him, to lean on his strength, to depend on his version of reality. And here he was, stripped of everything, reduced to stammers and sweat. I didn't answer. I simply walked closer, each step slicing the air like the toll of a bell. My hand hovered for a moment over the drawer, and in that hesitation, the memories of 1,000 sacrifices flashed before me. Nights I stayed awake, waiting for him, believing his stories about late meetings. Days I defended Claire when others called her reckless, insisting she was simply misunderstood. Every excuse I had made for both of them stacked like bricks around my heart, forming the cage I had lived in for far too long. Now, with my palm against the cool wood of the drawer, I felt those walls crack. The silence deepened. I inhaled once, deeply, and pulled it open. There it was, the gun Matthew had insisted we keep for protection, its black steel gleaming like an omen. My fingers curled around it, the weight shocking me into reality. Suddenly, everything was real, undeniable, and mine to command. Matthew's voice broke again, sharp with terror, as he lunged forward on the bed. "Jade, listen to me!" But it was too late. The power had shifted. For the first time in years, I wasn't the woman begging to be heard. I was the silence, the decision, the storm. Claire whimpered, covering her mouth with trembling fingers, her eyes glassy and wet. She whispered my name like a prayer, like I could absolve her with a single blink, but I had no mercy left. Not for her, not for him. I raised the gun slowly, savoring the way their faces crumbled under its shadow. The steel was cold against my palm, grounding me in a way that no words could. It was clarity, pure and merciless. My arms steadied, my breath slowed, and time itself bowed to me. In that stillness, my mind betrayed me with flashes of the girl I once was, the timid Jade who trusted too easily, who carried everyone else's burdens until her own spine bent. I saw her standing in the doorway, wide-eyed, believing love was enough to protect her. I almost pitied her, the naive child I had been, until I realized she no longer lived here. The woman gripping the gun was not her. She was something new, forged in fire, cut by betrayal, armored in rage. And yet, beneath it all, I wondered, was this strength or was this madness? My finger pressed lightly against the trigger, the line between the two thinner than a breath. Matthew's eyes widened, reflecting not the man he wanted to be, but the coward he had always been beneath the layers of charm. I saw his fear, raw and naked, and for a fleeting moment it satisfied me more than any bullet ever could. He had taken everything, my trust, my marriage, my sister, and now he was reduced to begging. Claire clutched the sheets as if they could shield her from the truth, but nothing could erase what they had done. I wanted them to feel every ounce of pain they had carved into me. I wanted them to drown in it, but above that, I wanted something more. I wanted the truth, stripped bare, carved into their skin, etched into their silence. The gun trembled slightly in my hand, not from fear, but from the tidal wave of power coursing through me. For years I had been invisible, dismissed, my pain hidden beneath practiced smiles and polite silence. But now, in this single moment, I was undeniable. Their fear filled the room, intoxicating and sharp, and I let it wash over me. This was no longer about them. It was about me, about reclaiming the voice they had stolen, the life they had tarnished. And yet, the question pressed harder than the trigger beneath my finger. What kind of freedom would I claim? The one drenched in blood, or the one born of walking away? Time fractured into shards of possibility, each one brighter and darker than the last. I saw myself pulling the trigger, their bodies collapsing in an instant, the silence complete and irreversible. I saw myself lowering the gun, walking out without another word, leaving them to rot in the ruins of their choices. Both visions pulsed in my head, violent and intoxicating. But before either could solidify, a strange calm swept through me. The moment slowed, and I felt as though the universe itself held its breath, waiting for my decision. And in that pause, I realized the truth. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about everything that led me here. Every lie I swallowed, every shadow I lived under. The gun was not my vengeance. It was my mirror. The story of Matthew and me began like something written under the glow of a summer sun. We met at a mutual friends gathering, where laughter spilled like champagne, and the air was filled with careless music. He had that rare quality of making everyone feel as though they were the only one in the room, and when his eyes landed on me, I felt an unspoken promise linger between us. I had been cautious with men before, protecting my heart behind invisible walls, yet with him, every wall seemed to collapse. Our conversations stretched long into the night, filled with dreams, ambitions, and quiet confessions. He told me he wanted stability, a life built on honesty, a home where love would anchor everything. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. He was everything my weary soul craved, and in those early days, he seemed to be my salvation. Our marriage began like a song, melodic and filled with crescendos of joy. We bought a small house with chipped paint and creaky floors, but to us, it was a palace. We spent weekends painting the walls, arguing playfully over colors, laughing when paint streaked across our skin. The house smelled of new beginnings, of roasted coffee in the mornings, and of lavender oil that I sprinkled on our pillows at night. Matthew kissed me with a hunger that convinced me we were bound forever. He whispered of children, of summers spent by the ocean, of winters curled by the fireplace. His voice was steady, his hands strong, and I gave myself to him fully. The world outside our walls faded. What mattered was what we built inside. At least, that was what I thought. And then there was Claire, my younger sister, 5 years apart, the golden one in everyone's eyes. Where I was measured and cautious, she was spontaneous, daring, magnetic. She had always been the center of attention, the one whose laughter seemed to command rooms, the one who turned heads effortlessly. Yet, I never envied her. I loved her. I protected her from bullies when we were children, shielded her from our father's harsh words, and gave up my own desires so she could have hers. That was my role, the protector, the giver, the steady one who made sacrifices without hesitation. When I introduced her to Matthew, it felt natural. She was my blood, my mirror of light and shadow. I trusted her the way one trusts the ground beneath their feet, without question. Claire entered our marriage like sunlight through a window, warm, familiar, and seemingly harmless. She visited often, bringing laughter that bounced against our walls, stories of dates gone wrong, and dreams of adventures she never followed through with. Matthew welcomed her presence, enjoying her vibrancy, often teasing her the way an older brother might. I saw nothing more than that. Why would I? The two people I loved most in the world shared a space, and I believed that space was sacred. I wanted them to get along. I wanted them to be family. But sometimes, What feels like warmth can be the beginning of a fire you cannot put out. Looking back, there were moments, fleeting, barely visible, that should have stirred suspicion. The way Claire laughed at Matthew's jokes a little longer than necessary. The way Matthew's gaze lingered on her when he thought I wasn't watching. But I silenced those whispers, dismissing them as paranoia. I had built my marriage on trust, and I had built my life on protecting Claire. To doubt them was to doubt myself. It was easier to believe in goodness, to choose love over suspicion. And so I smiled, blind and willing, while shadows stretched slowly across the light of our home. My mother used to say I was too generous, too quick to pour myself out for others. She'd shake her head when I gave Claire my favorite dress, or when I gave up my turn for something I had waited for, just so Claire could have it first. One day, she'd warn, your giving will leave you empty, and no one will notice. I never believed her. I thought love was inexhaustible, that sacrifice was noble, that my place was to support, to nurture, to be the foundation others could stand on. It never occurred to me that those I loved most could mistake my sacrifices for weakness, or worse, entitlement to take what was never theirs to claim. In the early years of marriage, Matthew often told me I was his safe place. You're steady, he'd say, brushing his lips against my forehead. You're everything I need. And I held on to those words like scripture, repeating them silently on nights when doubts crept in. I wanted to be his anchor, his partner, his forever. I thought that if I loved him enough, gave him enough, forgave him enough, he would never stray. Love in my eyes was a fortress, impenetrable if built with loyalty and care. But fortresses have weaknesses, and mine was blind devotion, my refusal to see cracks forming in the walls until they became impossible to ignore. Claire, meanwhile, confided in me often. She'd curl up on my couch with a glass of wine, pouring out her frustrations about men who didn't understand her, about jobs she couldn't hold on to, about a restlessness that gnawed at her. You're so lucky, Jade, she'd sigh, looking at Matthew's photographs on the wall. You have it all figured out. You have him. I'd smile softly, never knowing that envy simmered beneath her words, that admiration could curdle into desire. To me, she was still my little sister, the one I swaddled when our mother was too tired, the one I shielded from the world. I never considered she might become the very storm I should have shielded myself from. The seeds of ruin were sown quietly, like weeds sprouting beneath the soil. There was no thunderclap, no siren, no warning loud enough to pierce through the music of our daily life. Instead, it came softly, the subtle shift of Matthew's hand pulling away from mine too soon, the distant look in his eyes when Claire spoke, the faint chill in the air when laughter lingered between them. But I ignored it all, telling myself that love was stronger than shadows, that trust was thicker than suspicion. And in that denial, I unknowingly walked closer to the edge of the cliff that would one day swallow everything I thought unshakable. Looking back now, from the place of ashes and broken glass, I see how the ruins were built not in one moment, but in countless small ones. The laughter, the silences, the glances, they were all bricks laid quietly in the wall of betrayal. And yet, in those early days, I was blind, wrapped in the illusion of perfection, cradling a love I thought eternal. If I had listened more closely to my mother's warnings, or to the unease in my own heart, perhaps I could have stopped what was coming. But the truth is, I wasn't ready to face it. Not then. Not until the day I opened that bedroom door and heard the sound of my own heart breaking louder than anything else in the world. The first lie was small, almost insignificant, like a hairline crack in a flawless mirror. Matthew came home late one evening, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. He said he had stayed longer at the office, caught up in deadlines and endless reports. I believed him without question, because that was who I was, someone who trusted, someone who wanted to believe. He kissed my forehead and brushed past me, claiming exhaustion. Yet something in his tone was different, a hollowness that didn't fit the man I knew. I noticed it, but I swallowed the thought, telling myself not to be dramatic. One crack in glass, after all, doesn't mean it will shatter. But then came the second, the third, the countless others. Late nights multiplied like weeds in spring, each one accompanied by excuses that felt rehearsed. Traffic was unbearable, he'd mutter, tossing his jacket aside. The team needed me to finish up. Sometimes he'd add a vague detail, a colleague's name I had never heard, a meeting that left no trace on his calendar. I tried to brush it off, tried to see him as the hardworking man I married. But in the quiet hours when he slipped into bed after midnight, Smelling faintly of something unfamiliar, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself why my chest felt heavy with doubt. And there was Claire, my radiant sister, always present, always close. She started visiting even more, offering to help Matthew with his stress. "He works so hard, Jade," she'd say, her voice filled with a practiced sympathy. "He deserves someone to listen." At first, I was grateful. I had always been the giver, the one who held others up. Maybe Claire was finally stepping into that role, easing his burdens when I was too tired. But as I watched them laugh in the kitchen, their heads leaning close, a strange ache twisted in my stomach. I pushed it away. I couldn't imagine malice in her. She was my sister. She was family. The unease grew, and with it, the voice inside me whispering questions I didn't want to ask. Was I imagining things? Was my exhaustion painting shadows where there was only light? Every time Matthew touched my hand, I searched for reassurance, but found hesitation instead. Every time Claire hugged me goodbye, I wondered if her warmth was hiding something colder. Doubt seeped into me like poison, and I hated myself for it. I wanted to trust them, needed to trust them, because the alternative was unthinkable. And yet, my gut twisted, warning me of something I couldn't name. When I finally asked Matthew about the late nights, he laughed softly, pulling me into his arms as though I were a child with wild fears. "Jade, you're overthinking again," he murmured, kissing the top of my head. "You always worry too much." His tone was gentle, but laced with something sharper, mockery perhaps, or dismissal. My concerns, my instincts, were painted as paranoia. I felt small, foolish, even guilty for doubting him. I told myself he was right, that my love for him made me overly cautious. And so, instead of holding on to my voice, I let it fade. Gaslighting is not always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, wrapped in tender words that sound like comfort, but taste like control. Matthew made me believe my doubts were flaws in me, not fractures in us. Each time he contradicted my instincts, I felt my confidence erode. Claire reinforced it without meaning to, smiling at him, then turning to me with pity in her eyes, as though she knew how fragile I was. "You worry too much, sis," she'd echo. And just like that, two voices against one drowned out my own. My confidence had always been steady, grounded in sacrifice and love. But now it felt as though my foundation was crumbling grain by grain. I second-guessed everything. My tone of voice, my questions, even my silences. I found myself apologizing for things I hadn't done, shrinking so he wouldn't see me as needy, staying quiet so Claire wouldn't roll her eyes. The woman I once was, the steady anchor, the giver, began to dissolve into someone smaller, someone less certain. And the more I diminished, the more space there was for them to take. The house that once felt like a sanctuary began to feel haunted. The laughter at dinner was thinner, the silence afterward thicker. When Matthew's phone buzzed, he'd turn it face down. When Claire lingered too long, I'd find myself retreating to the other room, my chest tight with questions I didn't dare speak aloud. I began to live in fragments, in glances, in pauses, in the unspoken. Every creak of the floorboards felt like evidence, every missed kiss like a confession. Yet, I had no proof, only a heart that beat faster in warning. And so, I carried my doubts like invisible chains, convincing myself that love required patience, that suspicion was sin, that my mother's voice, "Your giving will leave you empty," was wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth. Glass does not crack without reason, and once the fracture appears, no matter how small, it will spread until the whole surface breaks. I was living inside that fragile glass, pretending it was whole, all the while hearing the faint, inevitable sound of it beginning to shatter. It began with a whisper, one I didn't want to hear. A friend from church, her eyes darting nervously, pulled me aside after service. "I don't want to upset you, Jade," she said softly, "but I thought you should know. I saw Matthew and Claire together, late at night, too close to be innocent." My body went cold, yet I forced a smile, shaking my head as though she had made a harmless mistake. "You must have misunderstood," I said, though my pulse hammered like a drum. I wanted to shut the words out, to erase them before they carved themselves into my mind. But whispers, once heard, cannot be unheard. They cling, echo, and grow louder in the dark. Denial became my shield. I repeated to myself that Claire was my sister, the girl I had raised like a second mother when our parents were too tired. She couldn't betray me. Matthew was my husband, The man I had trusted with every fragile part of my soul. He wouldn't destroy me. Together? Impossible. My friend's voice replayed in my mind like a cursed melody, but I covered my ears with excuses. People see shadows and think they're monsters. That's all it was. Shadows. Nothing more. And yet, every night, I felt those shadows crawl closer. There were moments, fleeting, tense, when I almost confronted them. When I walked into the living room and found them sitting too close on the couch, their laughter stopping abruptly as I entered. My throat would tighten, words gathering like stones, heavy and ready to hurl. But then Matthew would smile at me, warm and practiced, and Claire would stand to hug me, her perfume lingering like mockery. The stones dissolved into dust. My lips curved into a smile I didn't feel. I told myself, confrontation would only make me seem jealous, ungrateful, paranoid. And so I swallowed my fear, again and again, until it burned like acid. Fear was my jailer. Fear of losing Matthew, of breaking my family apart, of admitting that love could be so cruelly betrayed. I had built my identity around sacrifice, around holding everyone else together. To even suspect them was to threaten that fragile order. If I was wrong, I would be the villain who poisoned her own home. If I was right, the truth would shatter everything I held dear. So I chose silence, the coward's refuge, convincing myself that silence was strength. But deep down, I knew silence was surrender. Claire played her part well, weaving guilt and tenderness into every interaction. "You've been so tense, Jade," she would murmur, stroking my arm. "You work too hard. Matthew worries about you, you know." She twisted my exhaustion into weakness, my instincts into insecurity. When I apologized for being distant, she smiled knowingly, as if she were the caretaker, not me. The manipulation was subtle, wrapped in sisterly love, but her eyes gave her away. There was a glint I had never seen before, something sharp behind the softness, and still, I pretended not to see. The whispers grew bolder, not just from friends, but from the silence between us. I noticed Matthew's phone always face down, his sudden showers the moment he got home, the way Claire's visits aligned with his late nights. None of it was proof, but all of it was weight pressing against my chest. My denial became harder to maintain, requiring more lies told to myself than the ones they told to me. And the more I denied, the more the truth hunted me, prowling in the corners of my mind. I started avoiding mirrors, afraid of seeing the woman I was becoming. My reflection looked pale, haunted, my eyes rimmed with sleepless nights. I no longer recognized myself, the giver, the nurturer, the anchor of the family. She was fading, replaced by a trembling shadow who smiled through pain and nodded through betrayal. The storm gathered inside me, a storm I refused to unleash, but one that threatened to consume me from within. Each whisper of suspicion was thunder, each silence between them was lightning, and I was caught beneath the gathering sky with no shelter. Sometimes at night, I would wake to faint sounds, footsteps, muffled voices, a door closing too quietly. My body would stiffen, my breath shallow, but I never rose to investigate. Fear rooted me to the mattress, whispering that it was better not to know. My hands would clutch the sheets until dawn, praying for the morning light to banish the phantoms. But when the sun came, the shadows lingered, and the whispers returned. I was living in a house of secrets, every wall saturated with silence, every corner hiding betrayal. And still, I told myself I could endure, that if I loved enough, gave enough, forgave enough, the cracks would heal. But the truth was already inside me, gnawing its way to the surface. The storm was no longer distant. It was here, circling, waiting for the moment to strike. And I, blind and trembling, still clung to denial, still convinced myself that love could survive the weight of whispers in the dark. Matthew had always worn his charm like armor, polished and gleaming. To the outside world, he was the attentive husband, the man who opened doors and offered warm smiles, the one who spoke with such tenderness that people envied me. Behind closed doors, however, the mask slipped just enough for me to see the cracks. His sweetness came laced with barbs, affection that turned into criticism, compliments that melted into scorn. "I only want you to be better," he'd say after cutting me down, as if his cruelty was an act of devotion. I believed him for far too long, convincing myself that love could bruise and still be love. That was his power. He made me question not only him, but myself. Each word of affection became a leash, keeping me tethered to his version of reality. When he whispered, "I love you," it felt less like reassurance and more like a command, an instruction to silence my doubts. He had mastered the art of control, not through fists, but through words that seeped under my skin. He made me feel guilty for questioning him, ashamed for needing more, ungrateful for wanting honesty, and I obeyed, because the fear of losing him felt worse than the pain of being diminished. He had built a prison without bars, one that I entered willingly, believing it was home. Claire moved within that prison like a shadow, her presence both comforting and poisonous. By day, she was the sister who made me tea, who laughed with me about childhood memories, who reminded me of the bond we once cherished. But at night, behind doors I did not dare open, she belonged to him. I began to sense it in the small details, the way her hand lingered on his arm, the glances that passed between them like sparks I wasn't supposed to see. It was a betrayal wrapped in familiarity, and that made it all the more cruel. My sister, my husband, united in secrecy while I stood on the outside, blind and trusting. The loneliness grew heavier with each passing day. I had no one I could confide in, not even myself. My thoughts became dangerous territory, full of questions I was too afraid to answer. If I allowed myself to imagine their betrayal, the world I had built would crumble in an instant. So I filled the silence with busyness, cleaning, cooking, working late, anything to avoid sitting still with the truth. But no matter how hard I worked, the silence always returned, gnawing at me, reminding me that I was surrounded by liars who wore love as a disguise. Matthew played his role flawlessly, offering just enough tenderness to keep me bound. On the nights when doubt weighed too heavily on me, he would reach for me with a gentleness that felt rehearsed. "You're everything to me, Jade," he'd murmur against my skin, his hands warm, his eyes steady. I wanted so desperately to believe him, to sink into that illusion, to convince myself that I was still his only. But even in those moments, a sliver of unease cut through me, sharp and undeniable. His touch felt like performance, his words like lines from a script he had rehearsed with her too. The house itself began to feel hostile, a stage where I was the unwilling audience to a play I couldn't stop. Every chair, every shadow, every faint laugh behind closed doors became part of the deception. I would find Claire's lipstick on a glass and tell myself it was mine. I would catch the faint scent of her perfume in the hallway and insist it lingered from the afternoon. My own mind betrayed me, twisting reality into knots. The mask of love they wore blinded me, but somewhere deep inside, I felt the cracks spreading wider. The truth was no longer hiding. It was waiting. One night, sleep abandoned me completely. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my body heavy, but my mind ablaze with restless thoughts. The silence of the house was oppressive, pressing against my chest until I had to move. I wandered to the dresser, my hands trembling as though guided by something beyond reason. When I opened the drawer, my fingers brushed cold steel. A gun. Matthew's gun. Hidden but not forgotten. For a long time I just stared at it, the weight of its presence making my pulse race. I wasn't thinking of violence. Not yet. It was something else. A realization that power, however dark, could exist in my hands. I closed the drawer as though it were a secret I wasn't ready to claim, but the image stayed with me. That gun became a symbol, a silent witness to the life I was living. Every time Matthew's words cut too deep, every time Claire's smile lingered too long, I remembered the gun waiting in the dark. It was both terrifying and strangely comforting, a reminder that there was something they couldn't control. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of power, however fragile, however dangerous. The thought frightened me, but it also kept me alive. The mask of love was slipping, piece by piece. Matthew's control, Claire's duplicity, my own denial. They all converged toward something inevitable. I didn't yet know what form it would take, whether destruction or liberation. But I felt it growing, like a storm gathering on the horizon. And deep in my bones, I knew the mask would soon shatter, revealing faces I might not survive seeing. It began with small discoveries, the kind that could almost be dismissed if one wanted to remain blind. A hair that wasn't mine on the bathroom sink, a faint perfume lingering in the bedroom when Matthew swore he had been alone, the whisper of a laugh carried through the walls. Each piece was insignificant by itself, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Silence became its own accomplice, pressing down on me every time I entered a room they had just left. I felt like a ghost in my own home, haunting spaces where betrayal had already taken root. The cruelty of betrayal is that it doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it slips in quietly, like smoke under a door, filling every corner until it chokes you. I began to hear the unspoken words between them, the pauses too long, the glances too quick. At family dinners, Claire would laugh at Matthew's jokes in a way that made me feel invisible, as if their private world was seeping into the open. I told myself not to see it, not to give it power, but the silence grew heavier, more suffocating with each passing day. Matthew's lies grew sharper, cutting in ways I could no longer excuse. He would say he was working late, but I knew the rhythm of his footsteps outside our house when he thought I was asleep. He would tell me he loved me, but his eyes slid past mine, searching for something else, someone else. His cruelty was not in words this time, but in absences, in the hollow spaces where love was supposed to live. Silence between us was no longer comfort. It was a wall, thick and impenetrable. I screamed inside, but no sound escaped. Claire, too, played her role with mastery. She knew exactly how to manipulate me with her sweetness, how to lean into the image of the devoted sister. She brought me tea when I was tired, asked about my work, hugged me with arms that smelled of Matthew's cologne. The audacity of it cut deeper than knives. She betrayed me not only with her actions but with the mask of care she wore while doing it. I began to wonder if she enjoyed my blindness, if part of her cruelty was in watching me suffer silently, trapped between love and suspicion. My body began to bear the weight of secrets I hadn't spoken. Sleepless nights hollowed my eyes. Trembling hands betrayed my attempts at composure. I lost weight without meaning to, my clothes hanging loose as if even my body wanted to shrink away from the truth. Every time I tried to confront Matthew, my voice failed me, caught in my throat by fear of his denial. What if he laughed at me, called me paranoid again? What if he turned it all back on me until I doubted my own reality? Silence, though poisonous, felt safer than being dismissed once more. But silence does not remain passive. It eats away at everything. My home became a stage where every sound, every shadow turned into accusation. A creak in the hallway, a whispered word, the slam of a door. Each one told me what I refused to admit aloud. I felt myself unraveling, a thread pulled slowly, inevitably, toward ruin. The house I had built with love now held me prisoner, its walls thick with secrets I wasn't brave enough to confront. I lived among ghosts of truth, haunted by what I could not say. The night I finally saw them together was not with screams or confrontation. It was in silence, just as the betrayal had always been. I walked down the hallway, barefoot, the air thick with dread. The door to the study was slightly ajar, and through it I caught a glimpse, his hand on hers, her head tilted toward him, their intimacy undeniable. They didn't see me. The world went utterly still, as though even time refused to intrude. I didn't gasp, didn't cry. I only stood there, silence binding me tighter than chains, while the truth branded itself into my soul. When I returned to bed that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the image replaying endlessly behind my eyes. The silence was no longer emptiness. It was a scream, one I carried inside, one that promised to shatter eventually. I knew then that silence could not protect me any longer. The betrayal was no longer hidden in shadows. It had stepped into the light. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. Silence had made me complicit. By refusing to speak, by refusing to act, I had allowed them to grow bolder, stronger, until I was the outsider in my own life. Something had to break, and soon. Morning light became my enemy. It poured through the curtains as if to mock me, illuminating the fragments of a life that no longer existed. Every cup on the table, every shirt folded neatly in the drawer, seemed like part of a stage set carefully arranged to uphold a lie. I moved through the rooms of my house like a visitor, touching things that should have been mine, but no longer belonged to me. Love had become theater, and I was the only one without a script. The illusion of marriage, of sisterhood, had shattered, leaving only sharp pieces to cut me at every step. Denial had always been my refuge, but now even that cracked under the weight of truth. Whenever Matthew smiled at me, I saw his lips against hers. Whenever Claire called me sister, I heard the echo of her laughter tangled with his voice in the dark. The betrayal had not just broken my trust, it had stolen my reality. I couldn't tell where lies ended and truth began. Each memory I tried to revisit, our wedding day, Claire's childhood, moments of happiness, now looked different under this new light, poisoned by the knowledge that everything had been eroded from the inside. I tried to gather proof, as if evidence could steady me against the tide of disbelief. Receipts in his pockets, lipstick smudges too pale to be mine, Messages that vanished when I reached for his phone. They were careful, meticulous, yet their arrogance left tiny cracks. Claire's earrings forgotten in the bathroom, a bottle of wine emptied when I hadn't touched a drop. Every piece felt like a nail driven deeper into my chest, confirmation of a crime that still felt unreal. But proof brought no peace. It only deepened the wound, making the betrayal undeniable, stripping me of the comfort of lies. When I finally spoke, my voice was a trembling whisper, not the roar I had imagined. "Matthew, are you faithful to me?" The silence that followed was louder than any confession. He didn't answer right away, and that pause, just a second too long, was enough. His denial, when it finally came, felt rehearsed, his tone smooth and practiced. "Of course I am. How could you even think that?" Gaslighting again, the cruel art he had mastered. Yet I wasn't the same woman I had been months before. His words bounced against a heart already cracked open by truth. Confronting Claire was even harder. She had been the person I trusted most, the one I had shielded from every storm. Sitting across from her at the kitchen table, I asked a simple question. "Do you love him?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of guilt breaking through her mask before she forced a laugh. "Jade, what are you talking about? He's your husband." She tried to hold my hand, but I pulled away. That moment told me everything. The hesitation, the shift in her eyes, the shadow that lingered even after her denial. Lies wrapped in sisterly tenderness. That was Claire's weapon. The more I pressed, the more I felt myself unravel. My mind became a battlefield, torn between the woman who wanted to believe them and the woman who knew better. I began to keep a journal, documenting each detail. The nights he disappeared, the excuses she invented, the words that didn't add up. Writing gave me clarity, but it also revealed the depth of my entrapment. I was living in a house of mirrors, where every reflection was distorted, where every truth bent until I no longer recognized myself. It was not madness. It was the awakening of a woman stripped bare. The isolation grew unbearable. Friends who once filled my house with laughter now drifted away, sensing the tension but not daring to ask questions. Matthew kept me bound with promises of change, Claire with her tears and pleas of innocence. I walked through days like a sleepwalker, carrying the unbearable weight of knowing and yet being unable to act. Every moment I delayed confrontation, they grew stronger, weaving their narrative tighter around me. I feared that if I didn't act soon, I would disappear entirely, erased from my own story. That fear became my fuel. One night, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I no longer saw a wife or a sister. I saw a shadow of myself, hollow-eyed and trembling, a woman surviving on scraps of dignity. And yet, beneath the wreckage, there was a flicker of something fierce, a seed of rage, a spark of defiance. Betrayal had crushed me, but it had also forced me to see the truth I had long buried. I was stronger than their lies. The illusions had been shattered, and though the pieces cut me, they also revealed something undeniable. I would not remain silent forever. The time to act was coming. The weight of silence became unbearable. Days turned into nights with Matthew's vague explanations echoing in my head, Claire's forced smiles pressing against my heart like daggers. I couldn't breathe in that house without feeling suffocated by lies. Each room carried ghosts of conversations unspoken, truths smothered under rehearsed affection. My body moved automatically, cooking, cleaning, pretending, but my soul was screaming, demanding release. I could no longer play the role of blind wife and loyal sister. The truth was rotting inside me, and I knew if I didn't speak soon, it would consume me whole. My journal became both weapon and witness. Page after page, I spilled every suspicion, every detail, every half-truth that dripped from their lips. Writing transformed my fear into fire. Seeing their betrayals in ink stripped away any remaining illusions. It was no longer paranoia. It was a record, undeniable, living proof of my reality. Sometimes I traced the lines with trembling fingers, imagining how I would one day throw it in their faces, how their masks would crack when confronted with my quiet evidence. The journal became my silent companion, my confidant, and my rehearsal for the inevitable battle. Matthew sensed the change in me. His eyes searched mine with more intensity. His touch lingered too long. His words grew honeyed and desperate. "You're tired, Jade. You're overthinking. We should take a trip. Just us." His sudden gestures of affection felt like bribes, flimsy bandages over a festering wound. I almost pitied him, watching him scramble to maintain control. But pity is not love. and what little love I had left was rotting into something sharper: resentment, defiance, a readiness to tear apart the web he thought could hold me forever. He didn't know I was already slipping through his grasp. Claire, too, played her role with frightening precision. She cooked for me, offered to help with errands, called me sister with sickening sweetness, but her eyes betrayed her, darting toward Matthew when she thought I wasn't looking, softening when his voice filled the room. I began to test her, small traps hidden in casual conversations, mentioning places Matthew had supposedly been, watching her flinch when the details didn't align. She was careful, but not flawless, and each slip fed my determination. She was not just my betrayer, she was the thief of my trust, the desecration of my bloodline. The nights grew darker, my sleep fragmented by whispers in my head. Sometimes I swore I heard them in the next room, giggling like teenagers, mocking my blindness. I would press my ear against the wall, heart pounding, straining to catch a word that would shatter any lingering doubt. Most nights, all I heard was silence, but it was a silence alive with secrets. My mind began to blur the line between what was real and what was imagined. But one truth never wavered. They were together, and I was the obstacle. That thought became my anchor, my unshakable clarity. I began to prepare for the moment of exposure. I rehearsed words in front of the mirror, sometimes whispering, sometimes shouting, testing how my voice would carry the weight of betrayal. Would I weep? Would I rage? Or would I simply stand there, cold and unflinching, watching them unravel? The mirror showed me a woman I barely recognized, hollow-eyed, but stronger, steel hidden beneath the cracks. I realized I didn't want tears anymore. Tears had fed them. What I wanted now was silence sharpened into a blade, truth spoken like a sentence. The breaking point was no longer a possibility. It was destiny. And yet, even with all my preparation, fear gnawed at me. What if they denied it again? What if they laughed, turned the blame onto me, painted me as paranoid and unstable? It was their favorite tactic, and I had fallen for it before. But something inside me had shifted. Even if they lied, even if they twisted everything, I would not retreat this time. I would hold my ground. I would make them see the reflection of their sins in my eyes. The power they had stolen from me was already returning, drop by drop, with every breath I took. The night before it happened, I found myself standing before the drawer where the gun lay hidden. My fingers hovered over the handle, trembling. The weight of violence loomed, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I closed the drawer with a sharp click, whispering to myself, "Tomorrow, it ends." I didn't know how or in what form, but I knew the truth would be unleashed. Whether it destroyed them, me, or all of us, the silence would finally break. And as I crawled into bed, eyes open against the darkness, I felt it. The calm before a storm I had no intention of running from. The evening unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Matthew poured wine, his smile practiced, his words smooth as silk. Claire sat across from me, feigning innocence, her laughter chiming like broken glass in my ears. The table was set like a stage, every fork polished, every candle flickering with false warmth. My pulse throbbed in my neck as I forced each bite down, tasting nothing but ashes. They thought I was blind still, thought their performance would pacify me, but I was no longer their silent audience. Tonight, the curtain would fall, and the truth would rise like fire through smoke. I let them speak first, watching carefully, cataloging every twitch of their faces. Matthew leaned in, speaking about business trips and late meetings, words flowing easily, too easily. Claire nodded along, echoing his lies with subtle affirmations, a duet rehearsed 1,000 times. They thought their harmony was flawless, but to me it was discord, a symphony of betrayal that made my skin crawl. I smiled faintly, sipping wine, my calmness unnerving even to myself. The longer I held my silence, the more restless they became. They could sense it. My composure was the prelude to something irreversible. The moment came when I placed my glass down with deliberate slowness. "Enough," I whispered, my voice low but sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Their eyes snapped toward me, startled, as though I had spoken in a foreign tongue. Matthew chuckled nervously. "Enough what, Jade?" But his voice trembled at the edges. Claire shifted in her chair, her fingers knotting together, the mask slipping just slightly. The tension was thick, alive, wrapping around us like smoke. For the first time, I wasn't the one shrinking into silence. I was the one holding the match to the powder. "I know," I said simply, each word deliberate, stripped of decoration. The lies, the nights, the two of you. My eyes locked onto Claire's, then Matthew's, not wavering. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the faint crackle of candle flames. Claire's lips parted, but no words emerged. Guilt had robbed her tongue. Matthew recovered quicker, leaning back, scoffing. "This is absurd. You're imagining things." His favorite weapon, gaslighting, rolled easily off his tongue, but it no longer pierced me. I laughed, low and hollow, and slid my journal across the table toward them. "Imaginations don't keep records," I murmured. The journal landed with a thud that echoed louder than any gunshot. Their faces paled as they stared at it, the leather cover worn, pages brimming with their shadows. Matthew reached for it, but I pulled it back just enough to remind him. This was mine, my truth, my power reclaimed. Every late night, every excuse, every lie, all of it is here, I said, my voice steady, fierce. Claire's hands trembled, her fork clattering onto the plate. She whispered my name, Jade, but I cut her off with a glare that carried every ounce of betrayal she had earned. Matthew tried again, his charm weaponized in desperation. "You're tired, Jade. You've always been fragile. Don't let paranoia ruin us." The words once would have shattered me, sent me spiraling. But tonight, they fell flat, lifeless, incapable of binding me again. I leaned forward, my tone cold as winter steel. Fragile? No. I was strong enough to love you both, strong enough to trust. And you, both of you, shattered it. You turned my love into a weapon against me. The tears that pricked my eyes did not fall. They burned instead, fueling the fire in my chest. Claire broke then, sobbing, her voice shaking. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. "I didn't mean..." Her confession spilled, half-formed, desperate, but I raised my hand, silencing her. The sight of her crumbling no longer evoked sympathy, only a hollow ache where sisterhood once lived. Matthew's fury erupted at her weakness, his mask cracking into snarls. "Shut up, Claire," he hissed, exposing the venom he had tried so hard to hide. They turned on each other for a moment, their alliance fraying before my eyes. I watched, detached, as if witnessing strangers collapse under the weight of their own deceit. I rose slowly, deliberately, the chair scraping against the floor like a final verdict. My hand brushed against the drawer where the gun waited, but I didn't open it. Yet, the power wasn't in the weapon. It was in the truth I had finally spoken, the silence I had broken. My voice carried steady as I looked at them both, trembling, cornered. "You never had me. Not my love, not my loyalty, not anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy, irreversible, and in their stunned silence I realized the breaking point had passed. What came next would not be survival. It would be freedom. The house was silent, but it felt different now, lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. Matthew sat slumped in the corner, face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. Claire crouched on the sofa, her sobs low, ragged, the mask of control finally shattered. I walked through the room slowly, each step deliberate, feeling the weight of months of betrayal lift slightly with every footfall. No one dared speak. Words had lost their power after the truth had been spoken. For the first time in years, I felt untethered, unbound by the chains of deceit that had imprisoned me. I approached the gun in the drawer, my fingers tracing the cold steel, but I did not touch it. Violence had been a temptation, a shadow hovering over my rage, but the real power had been the words, the revelation of truth. They had believed control lay in intimidation and secrecy. I showed them that truth could shatter both. Matthew's arrogance, Claire's duplicity, their carefully constructed web of lies. It all collapsed without a single shot fired. I realized then that the greatest weapon is not fire or force, but clarity, courage, and the refusal to be silenced. Claire's sobs softened into quiet whimpers, her guilt finally anchoring her to reality. She looked at me with haunted eyes, realizing for the first time that our bond, the one she had twisted and exploited, could never be reclaimed. I felt no triumph in her pain, only a bitter understanding of consequences. Betrayal carries its own punishment, and I had become a witness to it, a force that could not be denied. Matthew, too, slumped back into his own despair, muttering fragmented apologies that were swallowed by the echo of his own failure. I stepped outside onto the balcony, letting the night air wash over me, cool against flushed skin, sharp with freedom. The city lights stretched below, distant and unbothered by the human drama inside my walls. For the first time in months, I felt like myself, whole and unbroken, no longer a prisoner of lies or manipulation. The night was quiet, but the silence no longer suffocated. It nourished. My heart slowed, and I breathed fully, as if reclaiming air I had been denied. Every betrayal, every whispered lie, had brought me to this moment of clarity. I knew there would be no reconciliation. Not with Matthew, not with Claire, not with the illusion of what I thought love was supposed to be. That door had closed, and I would not open it again. What remained was me, standing amidst the ruins, not broken, but rebuilt. I walked through the house, touching the familiar surfaces now infused with new meaning. Each room held memories. Yes, but memories now tempered by understanding and control. I was no longer a passive participant. I was the author of the next chapter. Later, I packed a small bag, leaving a note for them both, a final acknowledgement of their failure and my escape. The house, which had once been a cage, now felt like a monument to my endurance. I paused at the door, hand on the handle, feeling the power of choice coursing through me. Every step forward would be mine and mine alone. I realized freedom is not given. It is claimed, sometimes with bloodless battles, sometimes with the simple act of refusing to bend. Tonight, I had claimed it. As I drove away, the streetlights casting fleeting shadows across my face, I allowed myself a quiet smile. The storm of betrayal had passed, leaving me raw but strong, aware but unafraid. I didn't need them. I didn't need apologies, love, or validation from those who had failed me. My life was mine to live, unshackled, and I would never again let deceit define me. The road ahead was uncertain, but the fear that had gripped me for so long had finally been replaced with power. The horizon began to glow with the first hints of dawn, and I felt something I had not felt in years: peace, not because the past had been erased, but because I had survived it. I had seen the betrayal, endured the deception, and emerged whole, stronger than I had ever imagined. For the first time, I was free, not by force, not by revenge, but by the simple, unyielding act of truth. And in that quiet, fragile light, I knew with certainty that nothing, not even the deepest betrayal, could take me from myself again.